The paper presents the critique of the polymath Ibn Taymīyah to the philosophy, logic, and theology between Greeks and Muslims in his book Refutation to Greek Logicians. The paper consists of 3 parts: criticism of Greek and Muslim philosophy, criticism of the philosophical understanding of divine affairs, al-ilahiyat, comparisons, logicians and philosophers with Jews, Christians, and idolaters. Criticism of Greek and Muslim philosophy, al-falsafah. The philosophy and logic were known among Muslims after translations of Eastern Christians living between them, and their foundations are not found in the basic sources of Islamic knowledge, the Quran and the prophetic tradition or Sunnah. Reactions to Greek philosophy and logic among Muslim thinkers are truly diverse. On the one hand, there is an active reception of Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd. And on the other hand, the critical reaction to Aristotelian thought in general made by Ibn Taymīyah in his criticism presents a rebuttal parallel to the philosophers. Ibn Taymīyah's critique of philosophy is epistemological, legal, and social. In his book Rebuttal to the Logicians, Ar-Radd ala al-Mantiqiyin presents first his Islamic legal opinion on philosophy, second his epistemological and theological criteria for discerning the truth among social and religious groups, and third the superiority of Muslims in understanding theological affairs al-ilahiyat from their instance. Ibn Taymīyah acknowledged that the rebuttals of logicians and philosophers must use their language, لغتهم, and terms, اصطلاحهم, even if such terms are not found in the Quranic text or in the prophetic tradition, to be able to refute them, munadharatihim. Ibn Taymīyah criticized likewise divine knowledge, al-ilm al-ilahi, or theological knowledge of philosophers, also called by them supreme knowledge, al-ilm al-a'la. The first philosophy, al-falsafatul uliya, the superior wisdom, al-hikmatul uliya, or metaphysics, ma ba'da tabi'iyya, because it is not real or true knowledge of the creator or creation, in the words of Ibn Taymīyah. Criticism of the philosophy and cosmology of Ibn Sina are the center of Ibn Taymīyah's argumentation. The object of philosophy among Muslims is not the knowledge of happiness, but to understand the complete pure being, al-wujud al-mutlaq al-kulli, or the specific being, al-wujud al-'ayni. And both in philosophy have been devoid, tajarrada, of matter, al-madda. They exist only in the mind, al-dhihn, and only thanks to it they exist outside, al-kharij. Ibn Taymīyah also criticized the ontological division between the possible being, mumkin, and the necessary being, wajib, of the philosopher Ibn Sina, and recognized that it is not an Aristotelian division of his followers. In his ontology, the Persian philosopher affirms the existence of the first cause, al-illatul ulla, as a formal cause, al-illatul ghayya, for the celestial movement. So, these mixtures of Islamic theology and Greek philosophy among Muslims carries to, according to Ibn Taymīyah, ignorance of the Islamic religion, a contradiction, and it is based only on opinions. His critique of the philosophical understanding of divine affairs, al-ilahiyat. According to Ibn Taymīyah, Greek logicians and Muslim philosophers have left invalid foundations, usul fasida, in logical, natural, and divine affairs, and their followers cannot recognize these invalid foundations, which cause, among the Muslims, the ruin, dalal, and the exit of faith truth, haqiqatul iman, to the point that they do not hear or reason. Such a ruin is because the human being possesses 2 forces for theological knowledge, namely the strength of theoretical knowledge and that of the practical will, and both are necessary for the knowledge of God and for His worship, because the knowledge of God, Ma'rifatullah, for Ibn Taymīyah is not only epistemological but ethical and legal, and therefore the theoretical knowledge of the divine must be joined to the virtuous work, al-a'mal as-salihah. So their philosophy as a science of the divine without ethics is insufficient on its own. The key example, according to Ibn Taymīyah, to understand the error at-ta'til of the philosophers in their divine affairs understanding is the principle that comes from the Greeks, especially Neoplatonists, according to which from the one, al-wahid, does not proceed yasdur, nothing but what is one, wahid. Because when they try to apply this principle to God's creation, they cannot use a logical comparison, nor an inclusive comparison. Even Ibn Taymīyah proposed that the acquisition of knowledge, husul al-ilm, does not stop in logical syllogism, nor this is sufficient because knowledge of the divine needs knowledge of the Quran. But philosophers use the Quran not to understand theological issues, but to seek to match the Quranic text with their philosophical foundation. Usul. According to Ibn Taymīyah, Aristotle and his followers on the one hand treat very little the divine affairs, but most of what they have said was wrong. On the other hand, Ibn Sina took from the Muslim theologians and used Islamic legal terms to talk about the divine affairs beyond what previous Greek and Muslim philosophers said, through rules and sophistical approaches, and not through discursive, dialectical, or probative procedures. Therefore, the Muslim philosophers are, in the words of Ibn Taymīyah, the most ignorant ajhal of God, Rabbil Alameen, and propose that if Aristotle, their first master, Al-Mu'allim al-Awwal, studied their words, he would conclude that they ignore the divine affairs compared to what has been revealed to the prophets. Anbiya. Comparisons between Greek logicians and philosophers with Jews, Christians, and idolaters. Ibn Taymīyah acknowledged that the Muslim philosophers al-falsafah improved the ideas of Aristotle and his followers around the divine affairs, al-ilahiyat, but are still more ignorant than the Jews and Christians in them. He also mentions that the mistakes of Muslims who attribute to themselves the name of philosophers or pseudo-philosophers, mutafalsifa, called by Ibn Taymīyah logical philosophers, al-falasifa al-mantiqiyun, around divine prophetic affairs beyond and the legal norms are greater than the mistakes of Muslim theologians. While in the natural and mathematical science, philosophers are right for most of what the theologians have said around these matters. They lack knowledge, understanding, and are far from Islamic legislation. Ibn Taymīyah differentiates between the ancient monotheism philosophers, Qudama, and the polytheistic philosophers, as well as between the Sabian, pure monotheism, and the Sabian idolaters. In his words, the monotheist philosophers are who worship God only. They associate nothing to Him or no one and believe that He is the creator, muhdith, of this world. Among them are the monotheists who also believe in the creation, hudud, of the world. Such as some Muslim sects and even the idolaters in India, it also states that the polytheistic philosophers are more disbelievers, akfar, than Jews and Christians. Ibn Taymīyah compares the faith of philosophers with the faiths of hypocrites, al-munafiqun, to the point of mentioning that even though the Muslim philosophers believe in God and on the other life, Yawm al-Akhir, by affirming the necessary being, wajib al-wujud, and the resurrection of souls, mi'ad al-arwah, but not of the bodies, al-abdan. It is said that Christians are better than them and their predecessors, even if they do not believe in God or the other life, nor forbid what God and His Prophet have forbidden, nor follow the religion of the truth, Islam. Ibn Taymīyah states, despite atheists' denial of God and their inner disbelief, that they had more knowledge of God than the Muslims, philosophers before Ibn Sina. While the Greeks had only the knowledge of God that the Arab idolaters had, and their knowledge of divinity, al-ilm al-ilahi, is as wrong and lost as that of the Jews, Christians, and Muslim innovators. But still, the Muslim philosophers are more ignorant, and there is no further away from the knowledge of God than the philosophers, according to Ibn Taymīyah. So he shows the invalidity of the legal obligation that a group of Muslims had to learn logic. In fact, according to him, the truth, al-haq, that the logicians have is less aqal than that of the Jews, Christians, and idolaters. Because the truth between Jews and Christians in proportion, al-nisba, with that of logicians and philosophers is greater as a whole, just like that of the idolaters is greater as a whole and proportion to the theoretical and scientific philosophy, which is why the Greek idolaters who worship the stars, al-kawakib, and the idols, al-asnam, are worse than Jews and Christians after the abrogation and corruption of the religions, when they mix monotheism with idolatry and association in worship. According to Ibn Taymīyah, the idolaters are closer to what the Prophet said, akhbara, than the philosophers are, because their error, dalal, about the knowledge of divine affairs, also called theological affairs. So it is less than that of philosophers who, in the words of Ibn Taymīyah, lie about prophets and prophecy. So Jews and disbeliever Christians are more honorable, ashraf, than atheism in knowledge and works, and nor are at the level of Jews and Christians even after they have corrupted the religion. Ibn Taymīyah makes historical, theological, and legal annotation on Jews and Christians in this work, but it is in comparison to the ideas about monotheism of the philosophers, Tawhid al-Falsafah, in face of Christian Trinity at-Tathlith, that he finds his greatest controversial argument. For Ibn Taymīyah, the Christian scholars, noting that they could not switch the Greeks and Romans from idolatry to pure monotheism, they introduced among them a religion composed of the religion of the prophets and the religions of the idolaters. Just if the philosopher said that the one does not possess attributes, sifat, nor performs actions, af'al, the first being can only come from what is one, which is not observable in creation, not even saying, like philosophers, that multiplicity comes from the first through absent objects, which will be, according to Ibn Taymīyah, more erroneous, afsad, than what Christians said about the Trinity. Let's hear some conclusions. Ibn Taymīyah's criticism of the Greek and Muslim philosophies focuses on a philosophical understanding of divine, or a philosophical understanding on theological affairs, and aims to show that both Greek and Muslim logicists and philosophers are further away from the truth than Jews, Christians, and idolaters, and are more misplaced than pre-Islam Arab idolaters because of their theories. Ibn Taymīyah makes an epistemological critique of philosophy and presents it as insufficient for the theological understanding of Islamic beliefs, and sometimes as a denial of them or a way to stop believing. In turn, it includes an apologetic critique against idolaters, Jews, and Christians, typical of religious controversy, assuming in such tests that the errors and theological deviations for these religious groups are less than those of Greek and Muslim philosophy and logic, but sufficient to lead to an epistemological, religious, and social rejection of Greek philosophy and logic and their reception among Muslims. Ibn Taymīyah's criticism of logic and philosophy in general includes implicit use of both and, at the same time, explicit use of logical arguments and philosophical concepts, along with the theological explanation from the Quranic text prophetic tradition, and Islamic epistemology. His methodological criteria to consider philosophy insufficient or false to understand any theology or religion does not imply nor validate his criticism to Judaism and Christianism. The author criticized Aristotelian philosophy as discussed by previous Muslim philosophers. In a mixture of the text of Aristotle, his Greek peripatetic commentators, Plotinus, Proclus, and finally the Muslim Neoplatonism, typical of the pseudo-Aristotle in the text of the Theology and the Book of the Causes. His criticism shows that Ibn Taymīyah did not recognize the difference between the Greek and the peripatetic Aristotle and the medieval Neoplatonism pseudo-Aristotle among Muslims. Thanks a lot.